Iraq says Daesh is defeated at last. The country celebrates, but are its dark days fully behind it? We ask the man in charge of Iraq's relations with the world. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Iraqi Foreign Minister Ibrahim al Jaafari. Iraqis are rejoicing after the Prime Minister declared victory over Daesh. The terror group swept across the country 3 years ago, seizing control of vast swathes of territory. But now Haider al-Abadi says Iraqi forces have eradicated its fighters. Yet some say the victory was won thanks largely to the efforts of Hashd al-Sha'bi, a militia largely backed by Iran. It's led to concerns about Baghdad's deepening ties with Tehran. So much so, both were left out of the Saudi-led Islamic military alliance. But were they really expecting an invite? I sat down with Iraq's Foreign Minister Ibrahim al Jaafari to get some answers. I began by asking him if enough's been done to prevent Daesh from returning.
The people who made the victory were the Iraqi people. No one made it on behalf of the Iraqis. It is true that the governments and people of the world supported Iraq, based on the fact that the danger of Daesh is not only in Iraq, but in the whole world. Contemporary terrorism started in New York, and then it moved to Europe, then to Southeast Asia, reaching the Middle East. Iraq mobilized all powers to withstand and defeat terrorism. Iraq succeeded in that mission. It was a long journey, started in 2014 until the time being. We needed nothing more than the world's moral, political, logistic, and military support, as the war with Daesh was an unconventional war, and intelligence in this war plays a significant role. The world indeed gave us this support. Iraq crowned its war with victory. Daesh wanted to ascribe Islam to it and play on sectarianism. Daesh started with the 3 Sunni Iraqi cities, Anbar, Saleh al-Dain, and Mosul. Its false propaganda was clear. When Daesh invaded those 3 cities, it found the whole Iraqi people were against them, Sunnis and Shias alike. Those courageous Iraqi fighters were in those cities, Basra, Karbala, Najaf, and Diwaniyah. All those Iraqis resisted Daesh. So Iraq has proved to the whole world that Iraqi ranks are unified against Daesh and gained victory. The people who made this victory possible in those hard economic conditions will keep the torch of victory alight to sustain the results it achieved. Fallujah is a victim. You cannot calculate it like the rest of the cities. It was a victim, and Daesh had control over it. So the rest of the cities came together to support them. That's the first point. The second point is the secret to victory, was most importantly the unified political class. All Iraqis came together with no exception, both Sunnis and Shia from all religions, Muslims and Christians. They were all unified together under one banner against Daesh. The second reason for victory was that the armies and military personnel stood together. That includes the military, police, Hashd al-Sha'bi, and Peshmerga, counterterrorism forces, and other forces. All of them stood together under the umbrella of the General Command of the Armed Forces to fight Daesh. Those 2 secrets, political and military, created a response regionally and internationally, and so the world stood with the Iraqi people with the support of the United Nations. Today, Iraq has 16 positions working under the United Nations due to the votes that we received there.
But it takes me back to the beginning of that question to ask you, how can you be so sure that we won't see groups like Daesh emerge again? Because in the fight against them, some crimes were committed, sometimes along sectarian lines as well, whether from Hashd al-Sha'bi or other groups, well documented. So when you have people in a desperate situation, and if they were targeted specifically for being Sunni in the mix of the fight against Daesh, which is a righteous fight, how are you going to solve this problem long term? Because people essentially will rise up in revenge, won't they?
I'm speaking about the phenomenon of the popular mobilization units and their role side by side with the armed forces. It's a common scene, and I can show you a video on my mobile later. It shows how the PMUs stood to defend their Sunni brothers in Mosul. These claims are absolutely incorrect. The popular mobilization units gave many martyrs and sacrificed their blood and time in order to protect humanity and to help save people who were in the hands of Daesh in Mosul. Maybe there were one or two exceptional cases that happened, but that is very normal and it is possible to happen during wars. But the strategy of them here was to sacrifice and save innocent people and take care of children and women and civilians, and this is all. We have it documented and databased.
This is a footage that His Excellency
This is Sunni from Mosul. 7 families captured in Mosul. No drugs, no food, no water. Hussein Shiat from Diwania. He go there as a volunteer. He brought for them drugs, at the same time fruit, orange. He expected he's going to be died, to be killed. He saved them. He told him, you are going to be killed. He said, I'm going to be killed. But you are going to be alive and I'm going to be killed. 10 days he married already, 10 days. Ten days he married. His name is Hussein Kifah.
So this is the Iraq you want?
Yes. Yes.
But is this the minority or the majority?
No, majority.
That's the question.
Of course, the majority. I'm sure from my speech. Majority.
Connected to this has been an accusation that Iraq is not fully in control of its own country, and that next door Iran has too much influence on the country. Now, I asked this to the former Prime Minister and current Vice President Iyad Allawi, and he told me that Prime Minister Abadi has let in the Iranians too much, and that he said Iraq sometimes acts like a proxy state. He didn't say it specifically, but he said sometimes it acts like a proxy state for Iran, and he is very upset and disappointed by this. So as the Foreign Minister, as a former Prime Minister and as the Foreign Minister of sovereign Iraq, is it fair to say that Iyad Allawi is right and that Iraq sometimes has to bend to the will of Iran?
أنا ما سامع من إياد علاوي وليس من عادتي ما لم أسمع من الشخص أجيبه مباشرة.
Iraq fought Daesh on behalf of the whole world, including Turkey. We fought on behalf of you, Syria, Iran, and all the neighboring states. Iraqis fought on behalf of Jordan and the whole world. Otherwise, you would see Daesh fighters moving the capitals of this region. In this context, Iraq has fought as a proxy on behalf of the whole world. As for support, Iraq was open to all states in the US-led coalition, making use of its capabilities and support. Some states are not members in the US-led coalition, like China, Russia, and Iran. Despite these facts, Iraq did not close its doors and did not exclude Russia, Iran, or China from participation. In September 2014, I was in New York when the Chinese Foreign Minister called me on the sidelines of the US-led coalition conference. He said, "We want to help you, but our foreign policy does not permit us to join coalitions. We want to help you, but outside this coalition." My answer was, "You are most welcome." I said to him, "We need your help." Based on this, I say, Russia, Iran, and China helped us.
Let me ask you about the Kurdish referendum, because they went ahead with it, even though your government warned them not to, the KRG. They warned and they went ahead with it, and they had an overwhelming yes in an election that you did not recognize. Your government decided to be tough. Did it work being tough with them?
التعامل مع الأخوة الكرد كان تعامل دستوري.
The way that we dealt with our Kurdish brothers was on a constitutional basis, and the federal principles were ratified constitutionally. And we have no problem in establishing any region in Iraq, but it should be under the regulation of the Constitution. And when they first declared the issue of the referendum, it meant there was a warning of separation. And we discussed this matter with the international community and the Arab League states, and with the IOC and the United Nations, as well as non-aligned countries. And we said very clearly that this is not a federal issue, but this is a matter of division, and it will make Iraq divided and split apart. And what happened in Iraq will happen in Turkey too, and Syria, and Russia, and Iran. Because all these countries have Kurdish elements and the separatist infection. And if this started in Iraq, it will immediately affect these other countries as well. So we hear one more time, we did not only defend the unification of Iraq, but we also defended the unification of all your countries in Turkey and Syria and Russia and Iran. And the federal system in Iraq is considered the best federal system in the world. The United States of America has 50 federal states, and they have 50 American Congresses, plus 50 flags and 50 heads of state and 50 local constitutions. But the United States has only one capital, which is Washington. And they have one president, which is President Trump, and before him was President Obama. There is not a federal system in the world that gives the foreign minister and the defense minister a sovereign ministry. So we dealt with them in a very civilized way. And at first, when they raised the issue of the referendum, I spoke during a meeting of the Arab League states, and I said this will put Iraq at risk, and we rejected that. And I said this is not a legal or constitutional practice. And immediately I showed them the Constitution and started reading Article number 1, that Iraq is a unified country and does not accept any divisions. And the Arab Summit Conference voted by consensus without exception and condemned the issue and considered it unconstitutional and illegal. The same thing for the OIC and the non-aligned states. All of them rejected it in one word.
So we have the OIC here. We have all these bodies consisting of Muslim majority countries. It's a mix of Arab and Muslim and so on. Some Muslim minorities, but with substantial minorities. And then we have Mohammed bin Salman. He has some big ideas. And he decided to form an Islamic military alliance, 40 countries. And his idea is Saudi Arabia leading the Muslim world to fight terrorism, to make sure that Daesh doesn't come up again, and other issues, by getting together and forming like an Islamic NATO. And so when I look at the countries, I see even countries like Uganda. Yoweri Museveni is an evangelical Christian. The country has a 13% Muslim population. They're in the alliance. Countries like Uganda, Togo are in the alliance as well. 40 countries. They didn't invite Iran. They didn't invite Iraq as well. Are they saying, you guys are the Shia countries and we don't like you? And we are a Sunni alliance plus some others. Is that the lesson to you? What are they trying to say?
This question should be directed to Mohammed bin Salman himself. He is the one that should answer this question and not me about why the invitation is not being sent. But previously, the invitation was sent to us in order to establish an Islamic alliance, and we rejected that. Not because of anything except that they entered Yemen. And when they did that, and during the conference at Sharm el-Sheikh, I yelled at them and said, this is not true, because you are not trying to name it on behalf of the Arab League states. And that didn't even hold a meeting or a vote for it. And yet your Saudi forces entered Yemen. And this is a historical mistake. You entered and bombed Yemen, and that harmed many innocent Yemeni people. What happened now in Yemen? Innocent Yemeni people got killed, and Saudis got killed, and people from the United Arab Emirates also killed. And Iraq mentioned that from the beginning, that this is a historical mistake to enter Yemen in such a way, because Yemen will resist the occupation and is very stubborn to be occupied. We are usually invited to this kind of event, but we are rejecting to be part of an alliance based on this. The Arab states have many Arabs and even non-Arab people too, and Kurdish and Turkmen as well, especially in Iraq. There are Muslims and non-Muslims. Also, there are Sunni and Shia. We don't want it to be a religious or sectarian or national war. It should be a war with a humanitarian nature only, And without that title, we will never join any coalition. We are the ones who started this initiative, and we are the ones who rejected it. And we might accept a deal with others when this is going to be a humanitarian-based process that will not discriminate against people based on sex or religion or nationality.
Ibrahim al Jaafari, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imran. Thanks a lot. Shukran jazeelan.
Still ahead, the Muslim world declares East Jerusalem the capital of Palestine. What impact will that have on tensions in the region? And a shock win for Democrats in Alabama as its U.S. Senate seat goes blue for the first time in more than 2 decades. We ask former presidential candidate Ron Paul how much of a blow this is to the Republican Party. After a week of rage, leaders from across the Muslim world gathered here in Istanbul to unite against U.S. President Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. At an emergency summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, all 57 member states urged the world to recognize East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital. The status of the city is one of the most contested issues in the conflict, and Trump's announcement was seen as a huge blow to the peace process. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said the U.S. could no longer be involved, calling for the UN to take over. Vanessa Keneally explores the issue.
Perhaps it was just a matter of time. For years, U.S. presidents have pledged to recognize Jerusalem, a holy city for 3 faiths, as Israel's capital. But it was Donald Trump who finally did, igniting an outpouring of rage and violence. In the occupied West Bank, young Palestinians confronted Israeli soldiers. At least 3 people were killed and more than 80 wounded.
We say that the U.S. declaration dismissed all the positive decisions, hundreds of positive decisions, toward the Palestinian cause.
And it was that Palestinian cause which was supported across the world. But none of that support seemed strong enough to reverse Trump's decision. As civilians took to the streets, an emergency summit was held in Istanbul, where politicians from Muslim countries spoke up. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which represents 57 countries and regions, as well as 1.6 billion people, was hosted by Turkey's president.
Filistin devletini henüz tanımamış tüm ülkelere derhal Filistin devletini tanımaları çağrısında bulunuyor. Artık bizim nazarımızda Filistin devletinin başkenti Kudüs'tür ve öyle kalacak.
He added that the US can no longer be any kind of peace broker between the 2 sides. Then it was the Palestinian president's turn to speak.
إن إعلان الرئيس ترامب بأن القدس هي عاصمة إسرائيل وتعليماته بنقل سفارة بلاده إليها انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي والاتفاقات الموقعة.
Abbas added that Palestine will also submit an application to the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly asking for full membership. But the fear is that no amount of international intervention on paper can overturn what's happening in the Middle East or where it could lead to. While those in Istanbul may have declared East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu insist it's Israel's. And the line drawn between Israeli and Palestinians may now have become a permanent rift in the peace process. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from just outside Jerusalem is Alan Baker. He's the former Israeli ambassador to Canada. In Kuwait City is Salman Abu Sitta. He's the chairman of the Popular Conference of Palestinians Abroad. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Alan Baker, let me begin with you. So Trump made his decision and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The world reacted, and some recent reaction was a whole bunch of countries, the largest bloc of Muslim nations coming together here in Istanbul and calling on the world to recognize East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital. How do you feel about that?
Well, I would have no problem with that, assuming that there is a state called Palestine. Any state is entitled to a capital, as is Israel. So once a state of Palestine is established, and there isn't one yet, then the likelihood will be that it might well have its capital in Jerusalem. But that has not yet happened, and it's still not a state.
What do you think about Trump's decision? I mean, is it something that will scupper any final status negotiations, as has been claimed? Will it scupper Oslo, or is he merely just framing and stating the status quo?
Well, I think he's basically stating the status quo, and in his declaration he specifies that nothing in what he's saying will prejudice the outcome of direct negotiations between the parties on the issue of Jerusalem, which is something that the parties agreed to in the Oslo Accords.
Salman Abu Sitta, nothing that Trump did prejudices any final status negotiations. Do you believe that?
Jerusalem is not the subject of negotiations at all. Jerusalem is Palestinian longer than London is English. Everybody knows that since the Zionist settlers came from Europe to occupy Palestine during the British Mandate, there is many United Nations resolutions and committees which stated that Jerusalem is not Israeli. Even Israel, when it occupied West Jerusalem in 1948, that was in violation of international law, and that was in violation of the so-called Declaration of Independence itself, because Israel depended on so-called partition resolution of 181, and that doesn't give Israel presence in Jerusalem, Western Jerusalem, up to Lidda and Ramla. All this is occupied. West Jerusalem itself is occupied illegally in 1948. And of course, it goes without saying that in 1967, East Jerusalem is also illegally occupied by a plethora of United Nations resolutions, of Security Council resolutions, of the UNESCO, of the Geneva Convention, for the Geneva Convention. It's absolutely illegal, the presence of those Zionist settlers in
let me bring in Alan Baker for a second.
Okay,
fair enough. Okay, let me bring in Alan Baker here. Alan Baker, it's interesting, as we've seen in the past.
May I have a chance to respond?
Certainly. I just want to, if it allow me to just frame a question after that. We've seen in the past week, we've had Israelis respond by saying, well, you know, Jerusalem's been our capital for 3,000 years. And we've had now in the past few days, many in the Muslim world saying, well, actually, Jerusalem's holy to us and it's ours first. If we get into that with our parameters being religious, aren't we going to have an intractable conflict forever and ever? Why not use international law as a basis? And if we look at, for example, East Jerusalem, we find that it is, under international law, seen as occupied by Israel and annexed in 1980, and take it from there. Why not use international law as a baseline and not recognize something that the whole world doesn't recognize?
I agree with you absolutely. I think the gentleman who spoke a couple of minutes ago, he seems to be living in the past, and he seems to have completely forgotten that over the last 70 years there have been international developments. And one of these developments is an agreement between the PLO and the government of Israel that the issue of Jerusalem is on the negotiating table between them. Now, if he doesn't accept this, then he has his own problem. But this is a fact. And so the issue is an issue of international law and international practice. And once the Israelis and the Palestinians get back to negotiations, then it will be possible to deal with the issue of Jerusalem. going back into the Bible and into history is all very well. And the Jews have certainly got very solid claims over the past 4,000 years, long before the Muslims arrived in this area. But this is not the issue here. The issue here is implementation of an agreement between the Israel and the PLO to negotiate the issue of Jerusalem, together with other issues like borders, settlements, refugees, security, etc., etc.
Okay, so let me bring in another perspective here. I want to bring in Hugh Lovett in London. He's an Israel-Palestine project coordinator for the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you on the program, Hugh. Things have flared up since Trump's recognition of Israel as Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We've seen across the Arab street, if you like, and across the Muslim world, a lot of people are very angry. Are we at a place that we've seen before, and are we going through a cycle, or are we at a dangerous place right now?
Hi, and thanks for having me. So whenever we see these sorts of escalations on the ground, we hear people often rush to call this a new intifada, or to warn of an intifada breaking out. And I think, there's often a case of crying wolf. And so in this case, when one's looking at developments on the ground, I think it kind of stands in contrast to what we've seen over, say, what happened with the Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount and those metal detectors earlier this year. And in that case, we saw very much, I think, much more popular, grassroots-driven mobilization. I think obviously Haram al-Sharif is something that's very emotive to Muslims, but also to Palestinians. And there we saw an effort by Israel, but also, I think, by the regional states and perhaps also the PA to try to rein in those protests. Now, in this case, what we see with the reaction to Trump's declaration, I think is much more a top-down process, where we've seen the political factions trying to mobilize protests.
Right.
So, I see the dynamics as slightly different in this case.
Right, and looking at it top-down, Salman Abu Sita, we've seen Mahmoud Abbas won't meet with US Vice President Mike Pence when he visits the Holy Land. Is that petty or principled? Clearly, the Palestinians feel that the Americans aren't trustworthy enough, but why doesn't he just meet with the man?
Allow me to respond to the Israeli lawyer who just spoke. I think his argument is wrong on both counts. The first count is that you cannot negotiate on inalienable rights. That's a fundamental principle. And Jerusalem is not negotiable. The other thing about Oslo. Oslo has been dead. It's killed by the Israeli apartheid system, which destroyed the West Bank. So that's out. Then when we talk about the Israeli Zionists, talk about Jews have been there 2,000 years ago, nobody will build international law on such religious considerations. First of all, this history is not founded. Secondly, most importantly, if they were here and left, we Palestinians never left our country. So we stayed all these years before these settlers came from Eastern Europe ghettos.
Would you answer my question, if you don't mind? When Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want to meet with the Americans, is that a good thing?
Why should he? We know the whole story about the American policy. We have tried it for 26 years. It turned out to be not only honest, but dishonest broker on the side of Israel. It's very clear from all documents which are now publicly known that the United States position was to push the Israeli line and force it upon the Palestinians, and threatening them with cutting of aid and various other punishments. Now it seems that Mahmoud Abbas had enough of that, and therefore we must go back to the basic rule, namely international law, which all civilized nations must adhere to.
Okay, Alan Baker, let me ask you this question that many Palestinians want answered. They feel that Trump is siding with a military occupation here. So divorcing it from everybody's claims of history and so on and so forth, they look at military occupation that many live under in the West Bank, for example, right? And they see Trump as siding with the occupier, no more, no less, and that's why they don't trust the Americans. Would you have some sympathy for that perspective?
Not at all. You know, Mr. Abu Sita is repeating many cliches that are no longer relevant, and I think the question that you asked is perhaps indicative of a real lack of understanding of the American position. The American position from the very beginning, and let me just quote a letter from President Jimmy Carter to President Sadat in 1978 after the Camp David Accords, when he said very clearly that the US position remains that the issue of Jerusalem and other issues regarding the territory have to be negotiated between the two parties. And now this has not changed. Now, Mr. Abu Sita, I've been negotiating with Abu Mazen, with Mahmoud Abbas. I've been negotiating with Yasser Arafat, with Jibril Rajoub, with Saib Arikat, with all these people. And all these people have agreed to the fact that Israel and the Palestinians have to sit down and negotiate on Jerusalem. They acknowledge each other's mutual rights and the need to compromise on these rights.
Hugh Levitt, who's likely to fill the gap of the Americans if, for example, the Palestinians don't want to talk to the Americans, they don't want the Americans to mediate at all? Hugh, who do we see coming in to fill that gap on the international stage?
I don't see a situation in which the US will ever truly withdraw from the Middle East peace process. And certainly I don't see Israel agreeing to talks without the presence of Israel, of the US correction. However, you know, I think what is clear now from the Jerusalem announcement is that we will see other players trying to move in a bit, and we will see the Palestinians increasingly pushing for multilateral talks. And to answer your question, I think in that situation, you know, we'll see Russia already has shown an interest, and certainly it's been doing things on the domestic Palestinian track to promote intra-Palestinian reconciliation. But also perhaps there's a role for the EU, certainly not to create its own peace initiative, but to perhaps, you know, to invest more effort in creating the conditions for a meaningful resumptions of peace talks in the future and moving Israel towards deoccupation and helping Palestinians promote intra-Palestinian reconciliation. And then lastly, I think, you know, as ever, there's a role for the regional states to play, but this role has to continue to be based on the Arab Peace Initiative and not as Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Americans would want, which is what's called an outside-in approach, which resolves the Israeli-Arab conflict without resolving the Palestinian issue. Okay,
so Salman Abu Sita, the Arab Peace Initiative, if that is going to be used as a baseline for international or regional actors moving forward, it would mean still abiding by the hope for a two-state solution. Is that what you want, Salman?
Let me make it clear. There will be no lasting solution which does not depend on justice and international law. Politics can bend the arms of weak people, but they will not last. Today, as you have seen in demonstrations all over the world, Palestinians and their supporters around the world are determined to implement international law. Any implementation of any agreement which is contrary to the international law will not last long. Now, if the United States tried its course of action for 26 years and failed, we are forced to come back to the basic rule, justice and international law. Anything else will not work. And I may say also that if, for example, people have been forced to accept certain situations, the first people who actually violated them, like Oslo Agreement, is Israel. By its apartheid policies, it actually built settlements, brought 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, all contrary to the Fourth Geneva Convention, and they are considered, according to this agreement, to be war criminals. So no solution can last if it is based on force and not on justice. Okay. That is the final solution for any solution.
We are out of time, but I want to give Alan Baker 20 seconds to finally respond before I wrap and move on. Alan Baker, go ahead.
Listen, refusing to come back to negotiations or refusing to accept a third party that wants to be involved and to mediate is the antithesis of international law, because the whole idea of international law is to solve problems through negotiation and not through force and not through imposing solutions. Any suggestion that the UN could be involved is absurd. Nobody can expect the imposition and the prejudgment of issues that have to be negotiated. It takes two to tango, Mr. Abu Sita. Not more than that, only two. And the two are the Israelis and the Palestinians. And you won't be able to get around that. Sorry.
Well, we had a tango of sorts in the show today, and I appreciate you all
No, the occupier and the occupied.
Certainly. Sir, we are out of time,
The occupier
Mr.
and the
Abu Sita.
occupied cannot negotiate.
Okay, you made your point. Salman Abu Sita, Alan Baker, and Hugh Lovett. Gentlemen, I appreciate you all taking the time. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Alabama, in America's Deep South, has been about as Republican as a U.S. state can get. And yet, against all odds, Democrat Doug Jones managed to pull off the unthinkable by turning Alabama blue. His U.S. Senate victory was marginal, but the political implications could be huge. The president stood by the Republican candidate Roy Moore despite allegations of sexual misconduct. And many now see the result as a huge blow to Donald Trump and the GOP. So, was this a case of just putting the wrong candidate forward, or could the tide be turning against Trump's party? Basil Rehan takes a look.
I am truly overwhelmed. I am truly overwhelmed. But you know, folks, and you have all heard me say this at one point or another in this campaign, I have always believed that the people of Alabama had more in common than to divide us.
U.S. Democrats celebrating a rare victory in a staunchly Republican state. Alabama hasn't voted a Democrat into the Senate in 25 years. Winning a seat here is as symbolic as it is strategic, if not downright unusual. Then again, the Senate race has been anything but typical. The campaign of Republican candidate Roy Moore was marred by allegations he sexually abused underage girls.
That he was going to rape me.
He denies those allegations, and now he refuses to concede defeat.
In this race, we have not received the final count to include military and provisional ballots. This has been a very close race, and we are awaiting certification by the Secretary of State.
While other top Republicans denounced him and took cover, President Trump doubled down.
Jobs, jobs. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it, do it.
Trump has since congratulated Doug Jones in a tweet, and he's also claimed he knew all along that Moore didn't stand a chance. Regardless, Moore's loss is being seen as a major blow to the president. Strategists are scanning the election results to understand how it happened. Democrats squeaked to victory by a margin of just 1.5 percentage points. Alabama's deep racial divide weighed heavily in the results. Doug Jones won 95% of the African-American vote, but just 27% of the white vote. He also made significant inroads among college-educated white voters. But it was the African-American turnout that helped him overtake Moore's margins in more white, rural communities.
A lot of Republicans feel differently. They're very happy with the way it turned out. But I would have, as the leader of the party, I would have liked to have had the seat. I want to endorse the people that are running.
The results of this election have triggered a political earthquake, with shockwaves reaching all the way to the White House. President Trump's unwavering support for Moore increased divisions within his Republican Party. The damage that's potentially done to the Republican machine is not yet fully understood. The loss in Alabama also narrows the Republican majority in the Senate to just one vote. That raises uncertainty over many of Donald Trump's legislative goals, most pressing of which his signature tax reform bill.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as amended, is passed,
which Republicans are now trying to rush through the Senate. Even more troubling for the party is the possibility that this election defeat is the beginning of an anti-Trump wave. If that's true, it could mean Democrats have a good chance of gaining control of the Senate in the 2018 midterm elections. That's a loathsome prospect for Republicans across the political spectrum. So for now, many will likely prefer to agree with their president that this was just a case of a flawed candidate, and not a stunning rebuke of Republican policy and the Trump White House. Basil Rahan, The Newsmakers.
Well, we're joined now from Clute, Texas by Ron Paul. He's a former congressman and three-time U.S. presidential candidate. From Little Rock, Arkansas, we have Jessica DeLoach. She's a Democratic political strategist. And completing our panel from Valley View, Texas, is John Gibson. He's a radio talk show host. I thank you all for joining us on the program. Ron Paul, let me begin with you. Have the Republicans thrown Alabama away because they decided to choose someone who was beset with sexual misconduct allegations, nostalgic for slavery, and that's just the beginning of it? Did they throw it away?
Did the Republicans destroy themselves? I think it was a self-doing, but I think the basic problem is they wouldn't talk about the issues. They should have stuck with the issues, because allowing the media to build this big case of something that happened 40 years ago and let that to be the only thing in the event. As a libertarian, I didn't support Roy, and I think the problem is that both candidates aren't libertarians. So that is my biggest beef, and they don't deal with that.
Okay, let's bring in Jessica DeLoach. Jessica, was it really that much of a win for the Democrats? Because the New York Times, goes, big cities, college towns, and black communities gave it to Doug Jones, right? And people are seeing it as a sea change. They're looking at it as a kind of rebellion against Trump. Was it really all of that? Or is it maybe just the fact that the Republicans had a really bad candidate?
I think it's all of the above of what you've said, because the Democrats should not have won a Senate race in Alabama as it is right now. Alabama is a very, very conservative state. It's a state that President Trump won by 28 points, and the Republican Party managed to run a guy who could lose to a Democrat there. And I think what this tells us is that the Republican Party has been hijacked by extremists who carry extreme rhetoric that finally we've started to find unpalatable by a lot of people in this country. So what you saw in Alabama was a rejection of that extremism. That's not to say that Doug Jones would have an easy time getting reelected to the Senate in the future. It's just that they ran a very bad candidate because for some reason they could not find anyone better in the state of Alabama to run for that seat.
John Gibson, we have Michael Blake, the vice chair of the DNC, and a New York State Assemblyman, quoted in The Guardian as saying, "We've had in the past 5 weeks 2 black lieutenant governors in New Jersey and Virginia, a black female mayor in Charlotte, a black female mayor in Atlanta, and a win for Doug Jones, who prosecuted Klansmen. How can you not feel validated?" That's how the Democrats are seeing it. Is that accurate?
Not really. I mean, look, Doug Jones won because of a 14-year-old girl. Richard Shelby, the much respected Republican senator from Alabama, announced a couple days before the election he could not vote for Roy Moore, urged people to write in a candidate. The write-ins got 1.7% of the vote. Moore lost by 1.5%. It was a close election. Richard Shelby, a Republican, made sure that Roy Moore wouldn't win, and it was all about a 14-year-old girl. The Republicans actually won this election because if Roy Moore had won and gone to the Senate, the Republicans would be tagged as the party of pedophiles. And in a way, they dodged a bullet by making sure that Roy Moore didn't win.
Okay, so Jessica, was it all about his time as a DA trolling the shopping malls for teenage girls?
No, what this is about is that the Republican Party ever thought it was appropriate to run a sexual predator for office. If anything, the Democrats should be encouraged. People around the country are starting to see a rejection. Okay, so the Democratic Party, what we're starting to see in this country is a rejection of Trump-style politics, politics that's exclusive to Trump, that type of bombast. Look at Roy Moore. Look at what he said about the Constitution, how anything beyond the 10th Amendment is not anything that we need. He has extremist views. Those views have been parroted by Republicans throughout this country who have lost elections and will continue to lose elections because people in this country are tired of it, because our country is better than that. We're ready to move forward. So yes, the Democratic Party should be very encouraged, but they also should learn some lessons from this. They managed to mobilize very, very diverse groups of people to show up and make this victory possible. Anyone who thinks that they won't be doing that in states across the nation is foolish. These lessons should be learned across the board, and I'm very proud of the Democratic Party.
Okay, and Ron Paul, I know you ran as a Republican, but of course you are a libertarian. You're not a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. Let me ask you about how this might translate nationally. So we see that the belt of predominantly white counties in Alabama that were Trump's biggest backers in the election appeared to be, as the Federalist calls it, the most demoralized. Turnout was down 45% from a year ago among them. 1 year on, are those white Trump supporters experiencing buyer's remorse?
Well, what it's going to do is, and it's already done it, it has changed the tune and the tone of what goes on in our campaigns. Issues are unimportant, and if you can dig up something 40 years old and claim somebody's a sex predator and he's never been tried, never convicted, and just demagogue it, and it starts with the Republicans wanting to do it because they don't want somebody that they can't control. I've been there. I know what it's like to be independent-minded. Even though I am a libertarian, I voted closer to the Republican platform than anybody else, but they don't live up to that. They don't want independent-minded people. They couldn't control Roy Moore, and so therefore they had to find a reason. The people wanted somebody like that, so they had to destroy his character. Republicans started it. The Democrats chimed in. I think it has set the stage that this is going to go on for a long time, and probably about 2/3 of all the accusations will be totally false, and nobody will be able to defend themselves. And that is the real tragedy of where we've gone. But the reason this is the case is we're bankrupt and nobody has any of the answers.
Okay, but these are huge allegations, right? 8 women who have accused him of sexual misconduct when he was in his 30s, and they were teenage girls, right? It sounds as if you feel as if he's been sort of stitched up in a hatchet job by the media, but these girls were 14, 15, 16 years old at the time.
Well, coming forward is one thing, and it's a serious problem, but sometimes there's a lot of credibility loss that should be handled differently than politicians crucifying somebody in the news. This is what's happening. They cannot stand an independent-minded person. They will find something. There's a lot of imperfection. It's a horrible, horrible mess. It dramatizes what's wrong with our society, what's wrong with politics, and that's why a libertarian approach is quite a bit different. We don't get involved in that. We don't have to pick between two people who have no differences philosophically, and then it's a power struggle. And the Trump side of the Republican Party and the Roy Moore side of it was challenging the establishment of the Republican Party. That's what it's all about.
Okay.
It has and the other is just a camouflage to find a reason to get people to hate more.
Jessica, the man's crucified by the media, according to Ron Paul. What do you think?
Yes. I think that's a bit of an extreme way to look at it. First off, Roy Moore is not an idealist. And also, too, this just goes to show you how easy it is for men to dismiss women. How many women have to come forward before people start listening? I don't care how long ago it was. Also, guess what? The court of public opinion, which is what Roy Moore and any other politician is in, is where these decisions are made by the voters. Whatever is extended to him in a court of law is a separate situation. I am so tired of men being dismissive of women who have suffered at the hands of predators, and that is why Roy Moore got rejected by voters in Alabama.
What have you got to say about Bill Clinton? Isn't it about time people like you spoke up about Bill Clinton? Yeah.
Well, okay, people like me, I'm a 33-year-old female. When Bill Clinton was in office, I was a child. And also, too, I'm pretty sure that the Republican Party hauled him in and made an entire circus. If I'm taking what attitude? About women, listening to women? I have only ever been an advocate for people listening to women, so I don't need you judging me.
Even an adult then, okay, this is a good time. Call out Bill Clinton. Look at all the Democrats who've gone down in this sexual harassment purge, if you want to call it. The Democrats appear to be trying to purge everybody out of their party guilty of sexual harassment so they can turn it against Donald Trump.
Yes,
remember what happened in '98? The Republicans tried to do this to Clinton, and it blew up in their face.
Okay, John, give Jessica a chance to finish up. Okay, fair enough. You pose a question, Jessica. Go ahead.
Yes, at what point will your party be accountable for the president that's currently in office, who's had more than 16 women come forward and say that he's been predatory toward them? Don't talk to me about Bill Clinton until you can bring
voters voted him in.
Until what? Until the voters vote him out? Yeah, and guess what? You guys had a trial. You put Bill Clinton on trial and left him in office.
It's not a Republican
So you're just being hypocrites. You're being hypocrites,
not being a
and
hypocrite.
people are tired
got
of
elected. People knew
yes,
what these accusations
because guess what?
were.
The Democratic Party's keeping their house clean. Is Al Franken in office anymore? No, he's leaving.
No.
But what say you for all of the predators and sexual harassers in your party?
Okay, and I think we've had a whole lot of talk about sexual harassment here, and I hope you will find it comprehensive, because I want to ask a question about demographics and minorities here. Let me go to Ron Paul, and I'll get each of your comments on this. Ron Paul, the fact that black voters supported Jones over Moore by a margin of 96% to 4%, did that surprise you at all?
No, I mean, you know, racial politics has been going on a long time. As a libertarian, I don't even like to see the reports. The blacks voted this way and the whites voted this way. Blacks don't all vote with the Democrats, and they probably don't even get counted when they don't. So I don't like that racism attached to the politics. What do they say when the white people vote for a black president? They should be excited about that. But no, that's still evil. The white people are still bad people. So it's a racial thing that goes on, and a libertarian doesn't see people in the form of race and groups. We don't, you know, look and say women's rights and gay rights and all this. We emphasize individual rights. Then you don't get into these squabbles. How are the black people going to vote? If you present the case for liberty, liberty should be beneficial to every individual, no matter what group they belong to. It's irrelevant, and that is the problem. We have this racial politics, and then when governments pass out the loot, then you have to get on to a lobbying group to get some of your money back. Then you allow the military-industrial complex to control things.
Yes, former Congressman, and I apologize for interrupting you. Doesn't it suggest to you that when a man comes out and says America was great back when people treated each other nicely, maybe we had slavery back then, but we treated each other nicely, no black person would ever want to vote for him because he's nostalgic for slavery, when people owned other people? There was no individual liberty for black people then, Congressman?
Well, that has nothing to do with me, because I never supported Moore. And that makes the point about the racism that goes on. We need to eliminate all that. But everything is racism now. If you're black and a libertarian, you're a monster as far as the Democrats are concerned. They want to control people through race. If you're black, if you're not a Democrat, you're not black. It's insane. So people should be seen as individuals who have individual rights, and it's irrelevant to what group you belong to, and it shouldn't be, you know, pushed this way by the politicians and by the special interest groups and also the media and everybody else. Everything is racial. And I, as a libertarian, see everything as individuals. That is the important issue.
Okay, final 20 seconds each from Jessica and John Gibson. What does this mean moving forward? It's clearly big for Alabama. Jessica, is this big for the country? The fact that Doug Jones has won and the fact that Roy Moore has lost.
I think it's big for the country, but I also know that Democrats should not take anything for granted. If you want to continue races, you need to learn valuable lessons about what it was that allowed the Democrats to get over the finish line in this race, what it will take to do this in other states. They need to win 2 more Senate seats to stop the Trump agenda so that we can have more balance in this country, and that is very, very important. So set aside a lot of the word salad that happened in this conversation about women. The takeaway here is that it's important that people show up to vote and that they stand up for people that other people wish to disenfranchise.
John Gibson, is this an indicator that something is changing?
No. Democrats are expecting a wave election. They could get it, but only if the prosperity that has begun under Donald Trump fails. The election will always be about prosperity and the economy, and it will not be about race or sex harassment or morality. If the Democrats want to stand on that high ground, they could find themselves losing.
Okay, John Gibson, Ron Paul, and Jessica DeLoach, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.